to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News. The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today. Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. As our Foreign Secretary appears to go weak on China, we ask, should we trust that country? Joe Biden announces, yes, he's running for the presidency yet again, but is it really credible for a man who doesn't seem to have his full mental faculties? And the plight of Britons, 4,000 of them nearly stranded in Sudan, appears to be getting worse. We ask the question, has the Foreign Office dropped the ball once again? But before all of that, let's get the news with Bethany Elsey.
Nigel, thank you. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has confirmed the first flight evacuating British nationals out of Sudan has left, with many further flights being planned. Earlier, British Air Force personnel boarded a plane from Cyprus to Sudan to help with the operation. The evacuations were given the go-ahead after Sudan's army and a rival paramilitary group, which have been fighting for more than 2 weeks, agreed to a 72-hour ceasefire. But there have since been reports of gunfire and explosions in the capital, Khartoum, and in Omdurman. The Prime Minister says they're doing everything they can to evacuate people safely.
The first flight that left took everybody that was at the airfield and eligible is on that flight. There will be more flights this evening and then many more into tomorrow. We're contacting people both directly, but also we've issued out a general call for people, if they can make their way to the airfield, they will then be processed and safely evacuated. At the same time, we can't guarantee the long-term sustainability of the airfield that we're currently using. So we're also exploring and standing up other alternative routes for safe exit.
Nicola Sturgeon has spoken out about the police investigation into SNP finances, saying she couldn't have imagined the events of the past few weeks in her worst nightmares. The former First Minister also said it wasn't true that she stepped down because she knew about the problems about the untold within her party. She was appearing at the Scottish Parliament for the first time since her husband's arrest. Peter Murrell, the party's former chief executive, was questioned by police earlier in the month and later released without charge. The party's treasurer, Colin Beattie, was also arrested last week and released pending further investigation. President Joe Biden has officially announced he's running for a second term in office, saying the next election will be a fight for democracy and personal freedom.
The question we're facing is whether in the years ahead we have more freedom or less freedom, more rights or fewer. I know what I want the answer to be, and I think you do too. That's why I'm running for re-election.
The US president also confirmed that Vice President Kamala Harris will run again alongside him, and Donald Trump has released a video criticising Joe Biden for the so-called damage he's caused to the country and has called on his supporters for their vote.
With your support in the election, we will defeat Joe Biden in 2024. We will rescue our economy. We will crush inflation. We will stop the invasion on our southern border. We will restore our nation's dignity, and we will prevent World War III from happening.
And a man who murdered a 2-year-old while her mother was asleep upstairs has been sentenced to life in prison. Kyle Bevan caused catastrophic brain injuries on Lola James in July 2020. She died in hospital 4 days later. The 31-year-old denied responsibility, claiming the family dog pushed her down the stairs. He was convicted in April. Lola's mother, Sinead James, has also been sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of allowing her daughter's death. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+, radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Farage.
Tonight at Mansion House, in an annual speech, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, will speak exclusively about China. Now, he's going to say one or two things that are worrying. He'll describe it as the biggest military build-up ever seen in peacetime. He will criticise threats that are being made to Taiwan. But that's about as far as the tough talk will go, because he'll talk, too, about the importance of trade. He'll talk about the need not to isolate China. And actually, this is the British government's policy. Speak critically in some ways about China, but tomorrow everything carries on just as normal. I mean, don't forget, this was the government that wanted Huawei to be deep inside our 5G telecommunications system, only to be forced out of it later. And this is, of course, now 13 years into a Conservative government whose main strategy for the first decade of that was that this was a golden era of new relations with China. And we've stood aside, we've watched democracy being crushed in Hong Kong, we've said virtually nothing. And it's as if we go on trusting the Chinese regime? Or is it that the influences, the big money influences over the Conservative government are such they don't want any damage to trade at all? It's also worth noting that many senior people in the Conservative Party and movement, the Johnson family in particular, have very, very strong business links to China. I think it's weak. I think it's pathetic. Should we trust China? Give me your thoughts. Farage at gbnews.uk. Well, joining me is Luke de Pulford, Executive Director of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. There was a moment there when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. It was a very brief moment in many ways, but a moment there when it appeared that actually our policy on China was going to get significantly tougher. And yet, Luke, what we've seen is we've seen China getting ever closer to Putin and Russia, almost to the point where Putin looks like almost a proxy, I think, for China. And we've decided that as the Germans have been to Beijing and the French have been to Beijing, that somehow we have to be part of that club? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's a fair analysis. I'd put it this way. James Cleverly was the Foreign Secretary put in place by Liz Truss. And when that happened, we heard some positive noises from James Cleverly. And now we're getting very different signals from Number 10, particularly from the Prime Minister over China. We hear this very strange phrase, robust pragmatism is how we're supposed to be dealing with China now. I don't know what that means, and it certainly isn't an appropriate strategy for dealing with what is clearly our number one threat, which, by the way, Rishi Sunak even said on the campaign trail.
But he was running then to be leader of the Conservative Party. The tune has changed significantly.
It's changed very significantly indeed. I mean, he promised a number of things. He said he was going to close Confucius Institutes. He said it would change on, quote, day one of his premiership. Did any of that happen? No, it did not. Instead, what we're seeing today is James Cleverly chucking under the bus his Conservative colleagues who've had the bravery to stand up and talk about the Uyghur genocide, who've had the bravery to stand up and talk about the destruction of Hong Kong.
And they, of course, not just the MPs, like Ian Duncan-Smith, for example, and there are others, Bob Seeley, others, not just they that have been sanctioned, but their families, their children that have been sanctioned. Even a story in one of the Sunday newspapers that the daughter of one of those sanctioned MPs didn't get a university place because the university feared Chinese funding might fall.
Yeah, these are not the bad guys. These are not the enemy. The thing which is so distressing about the speech today is that it seems the Foreign Secretary is concentrating as much on attacking them as he is on addressing China. Well, what's all this about? What are we supposed to make of it? I think what it indicates is that our foreign policy seems to be as much about trying to manage difficulties in the Conservative Party as actual foreign policy.
No, well, that's a very strong point. I mean, President Trump, of course, was the one really blowing the trumpet, saying, wake up, everybody, see that China's changed. And indeed, since 2012, since President Xi came in, it has changed significantly. But I tell you what gets me, Luke. I think the public are waking up to this. It's very interesting. Opinion polls on concerns about China, should we buy fewer Chinese goods? And big percentages now agree with that. And yet, what I detect in the House of Commons is that even within the Conservative Party, it's a very small number of MPs who are genuinely concerned about this issue.
This is a really important point, because one of the things that the Foreign Secretary is apparently going to say is that that sort of hardcore of anti-China, noisy people in his own party need to look at the issue more broadly, need to add a bit of nuance. This is a cross-party consensus. If anything, the Labour Party is in a stronger position on China than the Conservative Party.
And where are they then?
Well, you've had the Shadow Foreign Secretary say just in the past few weeks that were they to get into government, they would recognise what is happening against Uyghurs as genocide. That's the same thing Liz Truss said, wasn't able to deliver on it. Well, we're a very long way away from doing that under the current government and the current Foreign Secretary, very sadly.
The influences are very, very big. You know, you can look at a list of former senior civil servants, big business figures, political figures who've gone on as non-executive directors on the boards. I mentioned Huawei earlier, but we could have talked about other infrastructure companies to do with power, nuclear generation, etc. I mean, isn't the truth that the Chinese lobbying, whether that's on a diplomatic level, bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together in the last few weeks, or whether it's on a personal, financial level, they've been at this for years, and we've only just woken up to it?
I don't think that we have woken up to it. In fact, we're waking up to it so slowly that it almost looks as if we want to be increasingly dependent upon China. The thing which is so remarkable about this is that it's not a secret. This is a clear and explicit strategy on the part of Beijing. Xi Jinping himself said a couple of years ago that they wanted to inculcate dependency of other nations on China, particularly in what he called killer industries, meaning those critical infrastructure areas.
If we put sanctions on China, real sanctions on China, that would hurt us too, though, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would, but you've got to look at this in the round. If Xi Jinping does what he says he's going to do, and if there is some kind of event in Taiwan, be it a blockade or something worse, we will have forced decoupling then. It won't be a choice. It'll be something we have to do. So the question for any government, I think, seeking to prepare for this is to manage the risk. You know, if this thing is coming down the road, what are we doing to prepare for that? Well, I'll tell you what is not the intelligent strategy, is to increase dependency in renewables and so many other areas that we're sleepwalking into. It'll be Ukraine crisis all over again, except 10 times worse.
Yeah, but trouble is, though, with Ukraine, you know, the West has been busily, or most of the West, the Germans have been a bit reluctant, but have been arming Zelensky against the Russians. But if there was a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, we'll all look to America to give us the lead. I suspect we'd do nothing.
Well, I put it this way. The Ukraine crisis woke a lot of nations up to the problem of dependency on authoritarian states, but it also woke them up to the issue of standing up to authoritarianism, the inflation crisis and everything that went with it. That's deeply worrying, because this wouldn't be a conflict in Europe. It's thousands of miles away, and it's one that, frankly, we don't have the preparedness for or the political appetite for. So would we stand with Taiwan? Well, it's a big question, and it's something that ought to be the focus of the speech tonight. How is it that we make conflict impossible in the South China Sea? Not how can we chuck a bunch of MPs who have sacrificed to raise these issues under the bus.
So how do you feel, Luke de Pulford? Disappointed, disgusted?
Deeply disappointed. I think that we deserve better. The issue deserves better. Don't know what's going on at King Charles Street. They seem to have this labour under this misapprehension that the greater enemy to them than China is the Tory backbenches. This needs to be sorted out and sorted out pretty quick.
Isn't party politics a wonderful thing? Thank you for that analysis. Well, as you know, I return to this theme on this show regularly. I do believe that the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest threat we faced in this country, and indeed across the entirety of the free world in many, many decades. But maybe the 47th president of the USA can save us all from it. And maybe it's going to be Joe Biden, because he's announced today, in a moment, we'll discuss just how sensible does that look as a man of 80 who will be 86 at the end of the next term if he won. Just does that make sense for America and all the rest of us?
Join me at 7 o'clock this Thursday on GB News for a big sit-down interview with Frank Bruno, where he talks, amongst other things, about his years at a borstal and how much good it did him.
Because a lot of people would say, well, if you go to a borstal, you know, it's a terrible thing. But you're saying, actually, it did you some good.
It's the best thing that could have happened to me.
Really?
Yeah, definitely.
Frank Bruno, Uncut, this Thursday, 7 o'clock.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today. Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my common sense crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So should we trust China? Some of your reactions coming in. Stuart says, shouldn't trust anyone. History shows this. Another says, sadly, we cannot cut China out of the world as they have embedded themselves into most manufacturing needs worldwide. You know, I did make that point just a few moments ago to Luke, that actually, yes, if we move down the path of sanctions, it's going to hurt us considerably too. That is absolutely true. But we should be weaning ourselves off dependency on China. And that means if this government really is absolutely hell-bent on going for net zero, on going for renewables, we need to manufacture our own wind turbine blades. We need to manufacture our own solar panels. Trouble is, if we do that, our carbon dioxide emissions go up. We're caught in something of a trap. And one viewer says, should we trust James Cleverly more than we trust China? And Nick says, no, we shouldn't trust China, and Cleverly is playing a dangerous game with them by revealing his hand. Well, Nick, I think what you're seeing is James Cleverly tonight getting ready for a big trip to Beijing, which will happen before the end of this year. Now, it had been very heavily trailed, certainly over the course of the last week. Joe Biden had been dropping hints that he was going to run again. Now, normally, you would expect somebody announcing a run for the presidency to hold a big press conference, to hold a rally. But in the case of Joe Biden, he released a video, and here is a short clip of it.
Freedom, personal freedom, is fundamental to who we are as Americans. There's nothing more important, nothing more sacred. That's been the work of my first term, to fight for our democracy. This shouldn't be a red or blue issue.
Freedom? A Democrat talking about freedom? Did you see what the Democratic governors did in those states they control? They locked them down, the cities emptied out. Biden himself, a firm advocate of lockdown, in fact spent much of it in a bunker in Delaware, and when he did appear in public, often was wearing 2 face masks. The Democrats are authoritarian. The Democrats now have a politicized judiciary, dragging people like Donald Trump into court in Manhattan. I can't think of a party that is further away from freedom than the Democrats run by Joe Biden. It is pretty astonishing. He says he wants to finish the job. Well, if he carries on the way he is, he'll probably finish off America and much of the Western world with it. That is my view. Joining me is Christian Whiteon, former senior advisor to Donald Trump in 2016-17 and the author of Smart Power, Between Diplomacy and War. Christian, as a Republican, I guess, in a way, it isn't just Joe Biden that's announced he's running, but Kamala Harris, the most unpopular, unrated vice president in modern history, is also going to be on the ticket. I would think, if I was a Republican tonight in the USA, I'd be pretty happy with this outcome.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty good day, and it's a sad day. If you look, you showed some of the more optimistic parts of the video. I guess it starts off, and you think that America is this place that is poised for a failure of democracy. That every day is January 6th. That really it's the Democrats running on 3 things where they think have going for them, which is January 6th, abortion, and they're also lying and saying that Republican candidates want to cut Social Security. There's been some talk in some Republican circles about reforming that retirement plan so it lasts longer, but all the leading candidates want to stick with it just as it is. So a very uninspiring, boring announcement, but very consistent with the 2020 playbook where Joe Biden spent most of the campaign in his basement and let his staff and the media do most of the work for him.
Yes, he did. Although, you mentioned abortion. I mean, I do think, you correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I do think that Supreme Court ruling, which of course wasn't at all removing the right to abortion, but putting that back to state level. And you can make an argument that that puts democracy in the hands of local people. But somehow, Christian, and I spent a fair bit of time in America in the run-up to those midterms, somehow it was portrayed that if you vote Republican, you know, your right, your freedom to choose, to opt for abortion would be completely removed. Isn't that issue? I know that there are many, many, many on the Christian centre right that believe passionately, you know, in the right to life. But isn't that issue an election-winning issue, or at least a vote-winning issue for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris?
It probably is, especially if Republicans don't do a better job of explaining it than they did in the 2022 midterm elections, where it really was thought to cost a lot of votes, especially the votes of people who abandoned the Republicans because they didn't like Donald Trump, especially suburban women. Republicans have to explain that it's not a total ban. The one that was just signed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is a ban at 6 weeks. That's a little different than saying no abortions at all. Really, I think that discussion needs to be pivoted too into how government can help pregnant women who are pregnant unexpectedly, and how to promote a culture of life and services like that, rather than focusing on the negative aspects of it. But yes, that's one of the issues that will potentially cost Republican votes. The flip side of that, of course, is Joe Biden already caused one recession. He's about to cause another, and you have this string of embarrassments around the world with Biden's failures.
Oh, look, you know, I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the retreat from Kabul did seriously dent America's standing and leadership in the world. Of that, there is no doubt. And there are domestic failures. You know, 6 million people have crossed that southern border. Crime in some of those American cities are just, I mean, beyond comprehension. And yet, he did quite well in the midterms.
He did. My own view, even though I was in the Trump administration, is that Donald Trump was a drag, that he chose candidates poorly, that the Senate should be in Republicans' hands now, and it's run by Democrats narrowly, especially because Donald Trump got behind very weak candidates in Georgia and Pennsylvania. A few of the people he backed did win. That was nice. But really, the moment we are facing in 2024 is different in some ways, in many ways, than it was in 2016. And we have other candidates who have all of the upside of Donald Trump, a willingness to fight, an unwillingness to let the liberal media set the rules of debate, unwillingness to just accept the old Chamber of Commerce Republican establishment. I mean, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, the governor of Virginia, we have a number of people who can do all of what Trump did without the baggage that comes along with him.
And yet the truth is that Trump is going to win the nomination comfortably, isn't he?
No, I don't think so. And remember, we go
really?
state by state. We start in Iowa, a small farm state, go to New Hampshire, another state, New England, Trump not very popular. Going back to Iowa, remember in 2016, Donald Trump didn't win that one. Ted Cruz did. So if you have someone like DeSantis win in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then South Carolina, which is a confused battleground state with two favorite sons, if you will, Nikki Haley, the former governor, and the current Senator Scott. If you do that, then no. I think if you look at Trump's support, there's some of it. There are people who are outraged at what's being done against him legally in New York, but that will fade away when people pay attention and see viable alternatives.
Well, we're not allowed to encourage gambling on this show. Otherwise, I'd like to have a bet with you, because I think Trump will get it regardless. But a final thought, Christian, if I may. How does it look for America when the man standing to be president again falls down flights of stairs, does handshakes with invisible people, messes up his words, and even in Ireland last week, you know, he confused the All Blacks rugby team with the Black and Tans, which is a real red rag to Republicans. I mean, it was just so embarrassing. It was so bad. It was astonishing. How does this look for America? Because, I mean, whether we like it or not, you guys are the leader of the free world.
Right. It doesn't look good. I was joking with a Russian friend, actually, that it was starting to look like the days of the Soviet Union before Gorbachev. You had Chernenko and Andropov and Brezhnev, all very old. And he joked back that those men were actually younger than Joe Biden. Now, of course, Soviet drinking and smoking and medical standards were different. But Joe Biden is clearly past his prime. And what that means is the White House staff is in charge. And that's not how our democracy works. Despite the fear of a strong executive creating that strong presidency out of the chaos that we had early in our years after independence, it's a critical way to get things done. And if that fails, if that person at the top isn't really functioning, it's very dangerous.
Christian Wyden, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GB News. Thank you.
Thank you.
Christian, they're saying that Joe Biden is past his best. No, he's not. He's a complete old duffer. At least that's my opinion. In a moment, let's talk to somebody from a Democrat Party who thinks this is a very good thing and that Biden will go on to storm to victory in the November elections next year.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, here at GB News, we absolutely pride ourselves on free speech, and we want to make sure that you, our viewers and listeners, hear all sides of the argument. So we've heard my comments, other comments too from Christian about Joe Biden wanting to run again. Well, let's get the other side of the story. I'm very pleased to say that I'm joined this evening by Bob Wiener, who was a spokesman in the Clinton administration and is a lifelong friend of Joe Biden. Bob, welcome to the programme. Let's be honest about it. He's had a long career in politics and on Capitol Hill. but his mental faculties are clearly not up to doing the job now, surely, let alone contemplating it when he's 86 years old.
Well, Nigel, you got to look at the cover of Life magazine when Grandma Moses was 101 years old and was featured on it. Life does not stop at 80. But more to the point, as Biden says, watch me. And they just showed yesterday on the cables the 25 bipartisan bills, bipartisan in this environment, from the infrastructure bill to the COVID bills on down, the CHIPS bills, the burn pit bills, 25 bills that Biden got through. It is a remarkable Rooseveltian achievement.
Well, you make a strong point there about the legislation that has been passed. And of course, in doing so, he has massively increased America's already very large budget deficit, feeding inflationary pressures into the system. And interestingly, subsidy is now being used in American industry in a way it never has been, certainly not since 1945. So fine, he's done those things. But equally, America standing on the world stage after the disastrous retreat from Kabul was hardly a success. Crime, as you well know, in cities like Chicago and elsewhere, totally out of control, and 6 million people illegally have crossed the southern border. On those points, it's not a great record, is it? OK, we've lost him, which is very, very unfortunate, because I was going to enjoy that conversation. But we'll try and get him back in a moment if we possibly can. Now, interestingly, what the Farage moment is that Indians, thus far this year, are the second biggest contingent of those that have crossed the English Channel. Nearly all young Indian men. It's not a country from which anyone should be seeking refugee status. These people are entering Britain illegally, and they shouldn't be allowed to stay. But of course, here's why they're doing it. They're doing it because if they can put in an asylum claim, in the time they wait, they can apply to a British university, and they can then pay student fees of £9,250 a year, and not the £22,000 a year that it would be if they were a foreign student. That is what is going on. And I'll come back to that point. Bob Weiner, I've got you back. I was just making the point that on Kabul, the border and crime, it is not a very good record.
Well, that's not quite true. If you look at 8 of the top 10 states are in hands of Republicans, and they have the highest crime rate. So there's a bit of fuddy-duddy numbers from the Republicans on that. And they wanted to cut in their budget 30,000 police. So who's the crime advocate? And talk about crime. The biggest crime was January 6th, fomenting insurrection, which, by the way, stops you from being allowed to run for office again. And there is a movement now by some organizations to take that to court. So on that score, with them trying to pretend that the biggest law enforcement insurrection in the history of the country, other than the Civil War, didn't exist, who's the party of safety? Who's the party of democracy? Who wants to protect democracy? And that's the point that Biden made today to the trade unions and in the State of the Union.
Two quick points on that. Number one, on January the 6th, what Trump said to that crowd was go in peace. So I don't think that is directly fomenting an insurrection. But more seriously, the real insurrection was taking place all across American cities in the name of a Marxist organization that wants to bring down Western civilization called Black Lives Matter. And as you know, many elected Democrats openly supported them.
Yeah, they didn't go running around killing people. That's nonsense. They were doing protests because there still is racism in America.
Oh, no, people died in those BLM protests, and you know that. Public buildings were set fire to. I mean, the point I'm making is all the Democrats can do is point to January the 6th. Trump did say go in peace. I mean, you know as well as I do that a city like Chicago, is worse now than it's ever been.
You're going there to say Trump said go in peace when the witnesses, Cassidy Hutchinson and others, said he sat in that room and his own press secretary said he gleefully watched the insurrection as it took place. And don't tell me that Roger Stone, who he saw every day, didn't guide him about what the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were doing. Of course he would. And he told the people to let the metal detectors, to let the people in with the guns. Jack Smith has a very strong case there. Fannie Willis, of course, has a very strong case about find me 11,780 votes.
I tell you what, let's get back to Joe Biden. You're quite right.
Okay.
Some people can be 100 years old, they can be fit as fleas, they can have all their mental faculties. Joe Biden makes gaffe after gaffe. Joe Biden has done fewer press conferences than any president for the last 40 years. He regularly mixes up his words. I mean, let's be honest about it. He's had a long, distinguished career, but he's now an embarrassment.
Well, from the party that brought you strategery and the president of the Washington Post, Trump said had 40,000 lies. Biden, his entire career, has done gaffe after gaffe. That has been Joe Biden. He's candid, he's honest, and he's real. And that's what the American people appreciate, as he did today in front of the building trade unions. What he did in the State of the Union, he manhandled the Republicans in negotiating about forcing them into say they would not cut Social Security, and locked them in so that to this day, Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans are now saying, which they didn't say before, they're not going to cut Social Security and Medicare. This guy is a master at getting people to yes.
So do you think, finally, Bob Wheeler, do you really think that with Kamala Harris as clearly a very weak running mate, I mean the least popular vice president in recent times, I'm stunned that he stayed with her, but do you really think he can win again in November 24?
Well, I challenge the American people to name more than 5 vice presidents of the United States, because it is the most obscure position that's out there. And the polling always shows that the vice president doesn't really matter. Kamala was smart in a debate and Joe picked him. I'm not sure that she did a great job on immigration or voting rights. She didn't call the summits and she didn't bring the people together to forge agreements. But those are very difficult issues right now. I think Biden has done a spectacular job, and that's what counts.
All right, Bob Wheeler, thank you very much indeed for putting the Joe Biden argument and doing it with such great passion. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you, Nigel, for having me.
There we are, both sides of the debate. I haven't changed my mind, but there we are. He does have his strong supporters. Now, I was talking, before we lost the line, about all these young Indians coming into the country. Now, a pretty extraordinary speech today by Robert Jenrick, and he was there at lunchtime speaking to Policy Exchange, and he said that excessive numbers of people arriving in small boats cannibalise communities by importing different lifestyles and values, and that the so-called far-right demonstrations are a warning to be heeded, not a phenomenon to be managed. Goodness gracious me, if I'd said anything like that, what I did in previous years, they'd all want to lock me up. So you can see what the Tories are doing. They're using the language of anger. They're using the language of frustration. They're saying, we are on your side on this issue. But whether the illegal migration bill is going to make any difference, well, we'll find out in the course of the next couple of months. Now, we talked a bit about Sudan last night, about who was fighting in that war, about the deteriorating situation, particularly for British and other foreign citizens. Today, with a couple of key witnesses, I'm going to ask the question, is this as bad a mess from the Foreign Office as we saw in Kabul a couple of years ago?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So the latest news is that 40 British nationals have landed in Cyprus, taken out from an airport north of Khartoum by an RAF plane, and they're hoping to get another 260 out overnight. But I'm guessing once people leave their houses in Khartoum and make their way unescorted to the airport, that must be an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And I just wonder, is this a bit like Kabul? Have we dropped the ball once again? There was supposed to be a 72-hour ceasefire, but apparently that's been broken too. So it seems to me that with the French and Italians and the Spanish managing to get hundreds of people out before we'd even made a move, it seems to me somehow that our Foreign Office and our civil service, yes, that civil service that forced the Deputy Prime Minister out of his job a few days ago, it seems to me that they may well have dropped the ball. Well, somebody who's been studying and writing about this is Mark Armand, who joins me from the Crisis Research Institute, Oxford. Mark, is this Kabul all over again? Have we simply dropped the ball?
Yeah, unfortunately, it does seem that the Foreign Office doesn't learn from its past mistakes. What happened in Kabul was in a similar situation. The Taliban were advancing, there was a state of war around the airports and so on. But there was a much bigger force already there, the Americans and the British. But things went badly wrong. All sorts of people were allowed onto planes who shouldn't have been allowed in, and all sorts of people who had served Britain, either had British passports or had been interpreters and helping the British Army, were left behind. What we see now is that there was no planning in advance. This situation in Sudan has been bubbling away for 3 years or more, and certainly over the last few weeks. But it turns out that the key players in the Foreign Office were on holiday from the embassy in Khartoum, and the kind of ethos of working from home, even working from the holiday home, is something that doesn't work in the home civil service at all well. And certainly you need people on the ground, and you need planning. Why didn't they learn the lessons of Kabul and have an evacuation plan in place, which even the Irish and countries which we don't think of as playing a military and international role were able to have for their citizens? Now, we have many more people in Sudan for all sorts of reasons, but nonetheless, we have got 40 people out to Cyprus today. That's mercifully a very good thing, but it's a tiny number of the potential people who need to be rescued if this internal fighting continues as it seems to be.
Yeah, I mean, leadership and planning, of course, absolutely crucial. And in Kabul, of course, the British ambassador did play a pretty heroic role. He didn't leave. Yeah. He stayed there right to the very end. And as you say, You know, the British ambassador to Sudan came back to this country on holiday over Easter, and he hasn't even returned. I mean, this is like the captain abandoning the ship. We've managed to get out all the diplomats, and frankly, it seems that everybody else can just fend for themselves. Don't the British government feel any sense of responsibility towards these people?
Well, this is a problem. We see, for instance, that the Army, the Air Force, and now the Navy have responded to the crisis, but they should have been got ready before this. It's not their fault. It's the fault, really, of the Foreign Office. And too many people in the Foreign Office have been spending the last 48, 72 hours briefing that they've done all they could have reasonably been expected to do. A lot of energy has gone into that, not actually into trying to roll back the problem. And all sorts of people in Khartoum have pointed out that you have to call the British government's call centre. Now, most of your viewers are used to trying to get through to a British government call centre about domestic matters and know how futile it is. When you have the local internet, the local telephone service broken down, interrupted by fighting, then, of course, it's a rather ridiculous idea. And so a lot of people in Sudan who had presumed that the British government would have some kind of contingency plan find themselves left to scrabble for an escape route.
No, it's awful. It's awful. Mark Arman, thank you very much indeed. Well, Mutaz Ahmed is the associate comment editor at the Daily Telegraph and comes from a family from Khartoum. And Mark there at the end basically saying, and you wrote a very passionate piece about this in today's Daily Telegraph. As I understand it, some of your family decided to ignore the advice and got out.
Yeah.
But you've got other family members that you think are still there.
I was texted or Instagram messaged by my cousin 30 minutes ago that he had to turn back, return to his home in Khartoum because the route isn't safe. This is part of the problem with having an airbase outside of Khartoum. Someone who has to get there must go through the war zone, through the checkpoints to get there, and we're assured that there's a 72-hour ceasefire, but it's not holding. There's lots of violence. And, you know, we're told the ambassador's working very hard.
What, from home?
From home in lovely Wimbledon. It's a great place.
You couldn't invent this, could you?
And we're told he's working 20-hour days, and I'm sure he's working very hard. And he's allowed to have holidays, and he went away for Ramadan, which is sort of understandable. But his deputy was away at the same time. Their head of security was away at the same time. And the person left to take charge of consulate affairs was the director of development, basically the guy who hands out British aid. Ambassadors, deputy ambassadors are trained to be there when there's gunfire.
The captain of the ship.
Well, exactly. And it isn't just about Sudan. If you're a British citizen travelling to parts of the third world, you'd expect, you know, we're a big country internationally, and you'd expect there to be support. But no, my cousins had to turn back.
Right. So how worried are you about family and friends? Well, is this, and it's difficult for us to get a real feel for this. I mean, obviously, you know, your family, your history, you've watched this destabilisation that's been going on. I mean, are we on the verge of an all-out civil war?
Yes. The battle lines have been drawn. But there's also this misconception that because, and it's quite understandable, that because Khartoum is in a state of war now, it has always been a dangerous place. That's not true. It's actually been a haven of peace in the region where migrants from Ethiopia, Chad, Kenya, and so on stay. Wars have occurred in other parts of Sudan, but that was conducted by the government in Khartoum that essentially implemented a security state that kept people safe. So the people there are not used to war. My cousin, who has one passport, which is British, his parents are from Sudan, who, you know, you'd normally see riding a bike on the road, not with a hoodie, but, you know, who hasn't seen this sort of violence before, is having to sort of find a way of working through this to get to an airfield that isn't even in Khartoum.
But initially, he was advised by the British government to stay at home.
Yes.
Just as the people in Grenfell Tower were told to stay in their flats. And it strikes me this advice is just about as bad.
Yeah, he was told to stay at home while not even British citizens, Sudanese nationals, by the thousands, left the city and went to safety in Egypt. British citizens were told, don't go with those guys, stay at home. This morning, the advice from the Foreign Office was, please do not come unless you're contacted to go to the airfield that we've now based our operations. that advice changed within hours to please just make your way to the airfield. There's no connection in Sudan. There's no internet connection for most people. If you don't have someone in London sort of fighting your case, you wouldn't know that advice had changed and that essentially you're eligible now for an evacuation.
We've got a few out, 40 out, another 260 overnight, but it does look pretty tough, doesn't it?
40 out.
I mean, 1%.
The French got 500
yes.
out yesterday. Look, it's a very tricky situation, but there will be British charity workers in Sudan. I fear that people who are clearly not of Sudanese origin, i.e. white charity workers who are British, may be targeted, right? If this war and the ceasefire looks like it's breaking down, if the violence erupts, they will be targeted.
Very concerning. Mutaz, thank you. We wish your cousin really well, we really do, honestly. But it sounds like a horrible, horrible situation.
Thanks.
I've got time for a couple of Barrage the Farages. I'm going to go first to a question from Ian from Aberdeen.
Hello, Nigel. My name's Ian. I would like to ask what your thoughts are on what is the point of devolution within the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Well, ask Tony Blair. It was all his great big idea. Look, the idea that we can have devolved powers, decision-making closer to us than central government, that, on the face of it, is very, very attractive. But I'm afraid that devolution has not done the people of Scotland any good. It has certainly not done the people of Wales any good. And frankly, it's all turned into a bit of a dog's dinner. There was this theory that if you gave the Scots far more power and a Scottish Parliament, that somehow that would stop the forces. Somehow would stop the forces of Scottish nationalism. And of course, it actually did the very, very opposite. So I'm not against the idea of decision-making being closer to people. But if you go on creating mayors all over the place, frankly, I wonder whether the whole country doesn't become ungovernable. Let's go to Jamie in Nottingham. Jamie, what have you got for me?
Hey up, Nige. Would you have Theresa May on Talking Pints?
Well, I don't think Theresa May would accept any invitation from me. After all, I think it's fair and reasonable to say the Tory party didn't have the guts to get rid of her. They tried, they couldn't muster the numbers. But I think the Brexit party absolutely did for her in those European elections. She resigned actually before all the results were in, and I enjoyed that very, very much. So I don't think I'm going to be top of Theresa May's list to come on Talking Pints or for Christmas cards either. Jacob Rees-Mogg joins me. Jacob, some very tough words from Robert Jenrick earlier.
Yes.
Very tough words.
Well, we now need to see the action. That's the key. But Robert is a very determined minister and I think can be effective. And Suella, of course, Home Secretary, really wants to make this happen.
Well, tough words. Let's
get the action.
Yeah, mustn't overpromise and underdeliver. What have you got tonight, Jacob?
What have we got tonight? There's a wonderful course being done for civil servants by an organisation that's going to get £140,000 taxpayers' money that hates all the Conservatives, loathes Brexit and thinks Boris is awful. Isn't that a brilliant way to spend your hard-earned money?
Fantastic. As we give hundreds of thousands of pounds to charities that encourage as many migrants as possible to cross the English Channel.
That hate this country. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. We give money to the most unlikely and insalubrious.
We've got to sort this out. It's no good. Jacob, we look forward to that very much indeed. Thank you, everybody. I'm back with you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. But first, let's have a look at the all-important weather.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Another chilly night for many of us, but not for all. There'll be cloudier skies towards the southwest, and as a result, it will be a bit milder. We are going to see milder weather approach from the southwest, and it's eventually going to affect much of the UK by the weekend, with temperatures rising in many parts. But with that milder air, we'll also see more changeable conditions, areas of cloud, some outbreaks of rain, and some heavy showers developing. A fine day on Tuesday comes to an end with clear spells across central and northern parts of the UK. The lowest temperatures once again expected across Highland Scotland, -7 Celsius possible in one or two sheltered spots. A frost then for Scotland and northern and eastern England, but elsewhere across the UK, a lot of cloud and as a result, frost-free towards the southwest as well as Northern Ireland. Here we've got cloudier conditions during Wednesday and some outbreaks of mainly light rain and drizzle. but it's going to be increasingly gloomy towards the southwest with the cloud covering hills and some coastal mist and fog. Meanwhile, brighter skies for northern England, much of Scotland. We'll see some showers developing across southern Scotland and northern England, but in between some sunny spells. And further wintry showers expected for the Northern Isles, but really it's sleet around coasts and snow confined to the hills. Into Wednesday night then, the cold air persists in the north of Scotland with another frost likely. Elsewhere across the UK, too much cloud to allow a frost to form. And in fact, we'll see some outbreaks of rain reaching western Scotland, southern Scotland by the end of the night. And as we start off Thursday, some wetter weather waiting in the wings towards the southwest. 10 Celsius in the Scilly Isles, a mild start to the day here, but a wet start. And that rain moves into the southwest of England during the morning, reaching South Wales later in the morning, and then becoming much more widespread across England and Wales during Thursday afternoon. Some thundery rain likely, and as that rain moves through, well, we're going to see conditions turn warmer into the weekend, but it's not going to be entirely sunny. There will be a lot of cloud and further showers at times.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6